fascinating discussion. We'll do it again. David.
Now, air travel at Christmas is stressful enough at the best of times, but it could get a whole lot worse with strike action threatened by Ryanair pilots in a number of countries, including Ireland. Senior Ryanair pilots here are to go on strike on Wednesday of next week, just 5 days before Christmas, with pilots in Italy and Portugal also set to take industrial action. So what does it mean for passengers, for workers and for the company? I'm joined by Deputy Brid Smith, who's spokesperson on workers' rights for Solidarity People Before Profit, and by economist Professor Sean Barrett of Trinity College. Brid Smith, as you understand, why are the pilots threatening to ruin Christmas for so many travellers?
Well, I don't know, David. It's going to quite ruin Christmas. My own sister is going to be affected trying to get back from Europe, but
and she won't be too happy about it.
She will get back. No, she probably won't be too happy about it. But I don't think she'll be too sad either, because I think she recognises that Ryanair have a long history of refusing to give the workers the rights of free collective bargaining. And that's what this is all about. It's not about pay. It's about the right to dignity at work, the right to choose your own representatives and not be forced into, having to be represented by those chosen by the Ryanair boss.
So it's union recognition, basically.
Basically, yeah. And this is 2017, not 1913. And we've been fighting for a long time for union recognition, many companies. But Ryanair, I suppose, epitomises the opposition to union recognition, of the worst sort. And this is really about dignity at work and free collective bargaining and the right to say, I want to be represented by whom I choose. If you go to buy a house, you have the right to choose your auctioneer. You're not forced into choosing just one that the market determines. And I think in employee and employer relationships, that's really important.
OK, Sean Barrett, the pilots clearly believe they have some leverage here, perhaps for the first time in the relationship with Ryanair. They're intent on using that leverage to get a better deal. That's market forces in action. They're only doing what Michael O'Leary does.
Yes, I think that's the economics of it. The organisation of the airline is based on internal democracy within the company, so that anybody who wishes to be elected to represent workers should contest the election. The opposition seems to come from the pilots, or a small proportion of them. They, as you said, do operate in a market economy, and presumably that's how they're paid. There's 33 staff for every plane in Ryanair. One of them is the captain. I would really like to know what the other 32 think, and that's not become apparent. I heard Ingrid Miley saying in the news, as a lawyer, a barrister herself, she expects this will go to law. When it was tested previously by Flynn and Macaulay, Phil Flynn representing the trade unions and Dan Macaulay representing the employers, that the majority of the staff then in Ryanair persuaded the two investigators that they saw trade unions as the means by which legacy airlines failed to grow in Europe and charged extremely high fares and were extremely small businesses. The Ryanair model was promotion from within. They felt that at that stage trade unions were the enemy, that they would turn Ryanair into another bankrupt airline, of which Europe has a vast number.
The company certainly views trade unions as the enemy.
Yes. And what has to be seen, Ingrid thinks this may go to court, what are the rights of those who elect within Ryanair at the moment, and what are the rights of those who prefer to have that task, as Brid said, carried out by somebody else. But in aviation, one has to say, European legacy airlines were high cost, burdens on the taxpayer, and the trade unions were on the inside of that model. They bear the responsibility, and hence the fear in Ryanair that they could do the same for them.
But isn't Michael O'Leary in a difficult position here? Because after the fiasco over the rosters, now he seems to have been given a fool's pardon by the public, by the travelling public over that. But if suddenly there's even the threat of strike action, suddenly Ryanair's reputation for being reliable goes out the window. That's 2 strikes.
Yes, and I think there were mistakes made in both the cases. But the success of Ryanair is not just due to the pilots. They have a very high load factor. That requires the staff who aren't pilots to sell all those seats, up to 94%.
Sure, but if Ryanair's reputation for not being affected by strike action and not being affected by the sort of fiasco that happened with the rosters, it goes out the window, the model is in trouble, isn't it?
The model would fail completely if it became another Lufthansa, another Air France, another British Airways. I chaired a meeting in DCU where they were discussing 30 years of European liberalisation, and the Aer Lingus chief executive was there. Aer Lingus has 12 million passengers. Ryanair is heading to 140 million passengers. You know, going back to the old model is extremely bad news for an outer offshore island. It's bad for outsiders and it's bad for customers.
OK, so the old model doesn't work, Brid Smith?
Well, it's interesting. I know Michael O'Leary was a student of yours, Sean, but it's interesting that he learned most of his operational model from a company called Southwest in Texas, which happens to be the most successful point-to-point carrier in the world, but it's also the most unionised point-to-point carrier in the world. So he was able to adopt the operational model of Southwest, but not the employment model of Southwest. And at the same time, what we're witnessing now, the disruption that happened recently to up to 700,000 passenger flights being cancelled was as a direct consequence of the European regulators telling him, you have got to run the fatigue clock for pilots from January to December and cut out the way you do it from April to March, which meant that he could use the pilots in a different way, which was an abuse of their conditions. So it's not about money. And it's not just purely about the conditions, although the conditions are feeding into not just the pilots, by the way. I have dozens of emails also from the staff on the airline who come under severe pressure to sell more scratch cards, more booze, more tea and coffee. And if they don't meet those deadlines, they're up in front of a disciplinary. Okay. So they need proper independent and free collective bargaining.
Just one last question to you, Sean Barrett. Do you think this is going to come to strike action?
I think Ingrid's model that might go to court is more likely. When it was tried the last time, the majority of people actually working in the airline, all 33 staff per plane, were very strongly of the view that they should not join a union of the kind that had wiped out the legacy airlines. It might have changed.
There's absolute distortion and propaganda to say that this was not a ballot of majority. Most of the pilots, over 50% of them, cannot join a trade union because they're self-employed. They're on bogus self-employment contracts. They don't pay into the system and they're left very vulnerable. But most of them want different types of contracts.
I'm afraid that's a discussion that we'll have to have a different time. But thank you both indeed for joining us. Mary.
Thank you.
Well, in October of last year, news broke that the body of an unidentified